September 29th, 1565. On a windswept Florida beach, 150 shipwrecked French sailors knelt in the sand, hands bound behind their backs, believing they'd just negotiated their survival. Within the hour, every single one would be dead. 12 days later, another 150 Frenchmen would meet the same fate at the exact same spot. 245 murders, one inlet, and a single question written in blood that would haunt European powers for decades. When does colonization become genocide? Think about those numbers for a moment. Spain didn't just defeat France's first serious attempt to colonize North America. They erased it, methodically, brutally, with a calculated efficiency that shocked even the violence-hardened courts of Renaissance Europe. And here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. The massacre wasn't primarily about territory. It was about faith. Catholic Spain versus Protestant France, fighting a religious war 3,000 miles from home, turning a pristine Florida beach into an execution ground. By the end of this video, you'll understand why King Philip II of Spain ordered what even his own officials called excessive brutality. How a single hurricane became the most important weather event in American colonial history, and what one French nobleman did 3 years later that made the Spanish garrison at Fort Caroline wish they'd shown mercy. But here's what doesn't make sense. How did France, one of Europe's great naval powers, lose an entire colony in a single week? Why would shipwrecked men surrender to an enemy who just slaughtered their comrades? What strategic value did Florida hold that justified mass execution? And how did this forgotten massacre determine whether you'd be reading this in English, French, or Spanish right now? To understand this bloodshed, we need to step back to 1562, when religious warfare in Europe was about to spawn a colonial catastrophe in the New World. Europe in the 1560s was tearing itself apart. The Protestant Reformation had split Christendom down theological lines that became battle lines. In France, Calvinist Protestants called Huguenots faced persecution from the Catholic majority that would soon explode into decades of religious civil war. The massacre of Vassy in 1562, where Catholic troops killed more than 60 Huguenots at prayer, was just the opening act of a bloodbath that would consume France. For French Huguenot leader Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the solution was radical. Move the problem across the Atlantic. If French Protestants couldn't worship freely at home, perhaps they could build a new Jerusalem in the wilderness of Florida. King Charles IX, desperate to diffuse religious tensions threatening to ignite civil war, gave his blessing. More importantly, he saw an opportunity to challenge Spanish dominance in the New World. In February 1562, John Ribault departed France with 3 ships carrying 150 colonists. These weren't hardened soldiers or experienced frontiersmen. They were religious refugees, skilled artisans, minor nobility, all united by one thing: the dream of religious freedom. Ribault first explored the St. Johns River in Florida, which he named the River of May for the month of his arrival. He erected a stone column bearing France's fleur-de-lis, claiming the land for his king. Then he sailed north to South Carolina, establishing Charles Fort on Paris Island. But Ribault's timing couldn't have been worse. When he returned to France for supplies, the First War of Religion had erupted. He fled to England seeking help, but Queen Elizabeth had him arrested for establishing a French colony in what she considered Spanish territory. Meanwhile, Charles Fort collapsed. Without supplies or leadership, the colonists descended into mutiny and starvation. Most eventually sailed for home in a desperate voyage that reportedly ended in cannibalism. In June 1564, René Goulaine de Laudonnière, Ribault's second-in-command, tried again. This time, 300 settlers landed at the St. Johns River and constructed Fort Caroline, a triangular wooden fortress. French artist Jacques Lemoyne accompanied them to document this New World venture. At first, everything seemed promising. The local Timucua Indians, led by Chief Satariwa, welcomed them. The fort took shape. Ships were unloaded. Then reality set in. These colonists included too many gentlemen and too few farmers. They'd come seeking adventure and wealth, not to break their backs tilling unfamiliar soil. When supplies ran low, some turned mutinous. Others became pirates, raiding Spanish ships in the Caribbean. These raids accomplished one thing perfectly. They alerted Spain to Fort Caroline's existence. Spain's reaction was predictable and furious. Florida wasn't just another patch of jungle. It was strategic territory of the highest importance. Every Spanish treasure fleet returning from Mexico and Peru had to ride the Gulf Stream up Florida's Atlantic coast before turning east towards Spain. Loaded galleons carrying the gold and silver that funded Spain's European wars sailed within sight of these shores. A French base here could strangle Spain's economic lifeline. King Philip II, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, saw Fort Caroline as both a strategic threat and a theological abomination. Protestant heretics squatting on Spanish territory, positioned to raid the treasure fleets that funded his campaigns against Protestantism across Europe. The situation demanded immediate, uncompromising action. Philip dispatched Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, a battle-hardened admiral who'd spent years fighting pirates and protecting treasure convoys. Menéndez was 46 years old, deeply religious, absolutely loyal, and possessed of a ruthlessness that would soon become legendary. Philip's orders were explicit: remove the French from Florida by any means necessary. Establish a permanent Spanish presence. Convert the natives to Catholicism. Menéndez had personal motivations too. His son Juan had shipwrecked off Florida's coast 4 years earlier and vanished. Somewhere in this wilderness might be answers about his fate. But more importantly, Menéndez saw this mission as holy work. Ridding Florida of Protestant heretics wasn't just strategy, it was spiritual warfare. In July 1565, Menéndez sailed from Spain with 11 ships carrying over 1,000 soldiers, sailors, and colonists. His fleet battered by storms, he reached Florida with far fewer than he'd hoped. At the same time, Jean Ribault, finally released from English captivity, was crossing the Atlantic with his own massive reinforcement. 7 ships carrying 600 fresh troops and 500 more colonists and sailors. The collision was inevitable. On September 4, 1565, Menéndez's ships arrived at the mouth of the St. John's River and found Ribault's fleet already there. The Spanish galleon San Pelayo opened fire. The French cut their anchor lines and fled. Neither side could claim victory, but both knew a reckoning was coming. Menéndez, recognizing his position was precarious, sailed 30 miles south to a more defensible inlet. There, on September 8th, he formally founded St. Augustine, claiming the land for Spain and the Catholic Church. It would become the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in what is now the United States. But in that moment, it was just a hasty collection of palm log fortifications around a Timucua village, vulnerable to attack. Ribault saw his opportunity. Fort Caroline now had reinforcements, while the Spanish settlement was barely established. He would strike first, overwhelming St. Augustine before Menéndez could fortify it. Against Laudonnière's advice, Ribault loaded most of Fort Caroline's fighting men aboard his 4 largest ships and sailed south. Then the weather intervened in the most consequential way imaginable. On September 10th, a massive hurricane slammed into Ribault's fleet. For days, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury. Winds over 100 miles per hour shredded sails and snapped masts. Mountainous waves drove the ships toward the jagged Florida coast. One by one, Ribault's vessels were wrecked. His flagship, La Trinité, a 32-gun galleass carrying monuments meant to claim Florida for France, ran aground near Cape Canaveral. 2 other ships broke apart near present-day Daytona Beach. Hundreds drowned in the surf. But the hurricane did more than destroy Ribault's fleet. It gave Menéndez the opening he needed. While the storm still raged, he made a decision that military historians still study: a forced march through a hurricane to attack Fort Caroline. 500 Spanish soldiers slogged through 30 miles of swamp and wilderness in driving rain and howling wind. They moved at night to avoid detection. They carried minimal supplies to move faster. It was miserable, dangerous, and brilliant. At dawn on September 20th, the Spanish burst from the forest and stormed Fort Caroline's walls. The garrison, stripped of most defenders when Ribault sailed south, never had a chance. The attack was swift and merciless. Spanish soldiers poured through gaps in the defences. What followed was slaughter, not battle. Menéndez's men killed 132 Frenchmen that morning. They spared women and children, but showed no mercy to fighting-age males. Laudonnière and a handful of others escaped into the woods, eventually reaching two small ships that carried the news to France. Menéndez renamed the captured fort San Mateo and left a Spanish garrison to hold it. But the real horror was just beginning. Returning to St. Augustine, Menéndez received intelligence that changed everything. The French fleet survivors were alive. Hundreds of them were walking north along the coast, trying to reach Fort Caroline, unaware it had fallen. They were hungry, exhausted, armed but desperate, and they had no idea they were walking into a trap. On September 28th, local Timucua Indians informed Menéndez that a large group of Frenchmen was stranded at an inlet about 15 miles south of St. Augustine. They couldn't cross the water and were trapped on the far side. Menéndez immediately marched south with a select force. The inlet that would give this massacre its name was probably what we now call Matanzas Inlet, though some historians argue for nearby Penon Inlet. Either way, the geography was perfect for Menéndez's purposes. A river mouth too deep to wade, too wide to swim easily, especially for exhausted men. The French had no boats, no food, and no options. What happened next, we know from multiple sources, including accounts by Spanish chaplain Francisco López de Mendoza Grajales. The French sent emissaries across the water to negotiate. Menéndez met them personally. The conversations that followed would be debated for centuries. Menéndez made his position clear. He'd captured Fort Caroline. He'd killed the garrison. He knew these men were Protestants, enemies of Catholic Spain. According to some accounts, he stated he was executing the king's orders to rid Florida of Lutheran heretics. According to others, he claimed he couldn't spare them because he lacked supplies to feed prisoners through the winter. The French, some sources claim, offered ransom. Enormous sums were mentioned. Menéndez refused. He would take no prisoners to Spain. He would grant no quarter. But he offered passage across the inlet in small groups, hands bound, to prevent escape attempts. Think about the calculation these shipwrecked men faced. They could surrender and hope for mercy, or scatter into the wilderness with no supplies, no knowledge of the terrain, facing hostile elements and potentially hostile natives. Many chose surrender. Menéndez ferried them across in groups of 10. Their hands were tied behind their backs. As each group landed, they were marched behind a sand dune, out of sight of their comrades still waiting. There, Chaplain Mendoza asked if any were Catholic. About 10 identified themselves as such. These men were spared, sent to St. Augustine. The rest confessed they were Protestants. They were given food and water. Then Menéndez's soldiers drew a line in the sand and received their orders. When the prisoners crossed that line, the killing began. Some accounts say they were beheaded. Others mention throats cut. One source claims Menéndez himself participated in the executions. September 29th, 1565, the Feast of St. Michael, became a day of slaughter. Around 150 French Huguenots died at that inlet. Their bodies were left where they fell. The place got a new name, Matanzas, Spanish for slaughters. But the massacre wasn't finished. Ribault himself had survived the shipwreck further south near Cape Canaveral. With perhaps 350 men, he'd begun the long march north. On October 11th, Timucua scouts informed Menéndez that another large French group had reached the same inlet. The second encounter followed the same grim pattern. Ribault, exhausted and desperate, negotiated with Menéndez from across the water. Sources differ on the details, but all agree Ribault tried to buy his men's freedom. Some accounts claim he offered 100,000 ducats, an enormous ransom. Menéndez refused. According to multiple sources, Ribault then asked for time to confer with his men. About half chose to take their chances in the wilderness rather than trust Spanish mercy. They vanished into Florida's interior. Most probably died from starvation, disease, or attacks by native tribes. Ribault and roughly 150 others surrendered. October 12th became another day of massacre. The procedure was identical. Small groups ferried across. A few Catholics spared. The rest executed behind the dunes. Ribault, the Protestant naval commander who'd planted France's flag on Florida soil 3 years earlier, was among the dead. Details about Ribault's final moments vary wildly. Some accounts say he died quickly. Others claim he was tortured. One particularly gruesome chronicle states Menéndez himself killed Ribault with a dagger to the belly, then had his head cut off. After the executions, some sources say the Spanish hung bodies from trees with placards reading, "Not as Frenchmen, but as Lutherans." Other sources doubt this detail. What's certain is that France's attempt to colonize Florida ended in blood on that beach. The massacre shocked Europe, even by the violent standards of religious warfare. In Spain, King Philip II initially approved. On the back of a dispatch from Menéndez, Philip wrote, "As to those he has killed, he has done well, and as to those he has saved, they shall be sent to the galleys." But even in Catholic Spain, voices questioned the necessity of such brutality. In France, outrage was universal. Laudonnière and other survivors spread accounts of the atrocity. The French court protested to Spain, but did nothing militarily. France was too consumed by its own religious civil wars to mount a response. The wars of religion that would ravage France for another 30 years had already begun. French Huguenots dreaming of colonial refuge would have to look elsewhere. But one Frenchman wouldn't forget. Dominique de Gourgues was a Catholic nobleman who'd served in Italy, been captured by Spaniards, and spent years as a galley slave before Turkish pirates captured his Spanish galley and eventually freed him. He had no love for Spain. When news of the Matanzas Massacre reached France, de Gourgues sold everything he owned and borrowed more from his brother. In 1568, 3 years after the massacre, he chartered 3 ships and recruited 200 men. De Gourgues never told his crew their true destination until they reached the Caribbean. When he finally revealed they were heading to Spanish Florida to avenge Fort Caroline, his men overwhelmingly agreed. They enlisted the help of Fort Caroline's old allies, the Timucua under Chief Saturiwa, who still resented the Spanish takeover. In April 1568, de Gourgues attacked Fort San Mateo. The Spanish garrison, caught by surprise, surrendered quickly. What happened next mirrored Matanzas in every detail except one. De Gourgues hanged his Spanish prisoners from trees, with inscriptions reading, "Not as Spaniards, but as murderers." Then he burned the fort and sailed for France, arriving safely in June. Spain rebuilt Fort San Mateo, but abandoned it permanently in 1569. The revenge raid had accomplished nothing strategically. France never returned to Florida in force. But de Gourgues had made his point. The massacre would be answered, even if his own government wouldn't do it. The consequences of Matanzas rippled through centuries. Spain's brutal assertion of control secured Florida for 250 years. St. Augustine became the anchor of Spanish Florida, a network of missions and presidios extending from modern Georgia to the Florida Keys. The treasure fleets continued to sail safely up the coast, funding Spain's wars in Europe. For France, Matanzas marked the end of colonial ambitions in the southeast. Huguenot refugees would eventually settle in other colonies, South Carolina, New York, eventually dispersing throughout British and Dutch territories. But France's 21st challenge Spain in Florida had closed. That closure changed the linguistic and cultural map of North America. The massacre also established a precedent that would haunt European colonization. Religious differences weren't just theological debates when empires clashed in the New World. They became justification for atrocity. The same logic that led to Matanzas would recur in conflicts between Catholic and Protestant colonizers throughout the Americas. Think about the historical pivot point. Without that September 1565 hurricane, Ribault's reinforced fleet might have overwhelmed St. Augustine before Menéndez could fortify it. Spanish Florida might have fallen to France. The oldest continuously occupied city in what became the United States might speak French today. The entire pattern of colonial settlement in the southeast could have shifted. But the storm struck. Menéndez seized his opportunity, and 245 men died at an inlet that still bears witness to their slaughter. Fort Matanzas, a stone watchtower built by Spain in 1742, now stands near the site. The inlet, the river, the entire area carries the name Matanzas. Slaughters in Spanish, a permanent geographic reminder of colonization's brutal calculus. The massacre also reveals something uncomfortable about the foundations of American colonial history. We often learn about Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, about religious freedom and brave settlers. We hear less about Matanzas, about Fort Caroline, about the French Huguenots who sought freedom first and found death instead. Jean Ribault and his colonists weren't conquerors seeking gold. They were refugees seeking sanctuary. They built alliances with native tribes. They documented the landscape and its people. Jacques Lemoyne's paintings and drawings provide some of the earliest European images of Florida's indigenous peoples. Then Spanish steel ended it all in a week of coordinated violence. Pedro Menéndez lived 8 more years after Matanzas, dying in 1574. History remembers him as the founder of St. Augustine, a successful adelantado who secured Florida for Spain. Spanish historians largely praised him. His own writings show little remorse about the executions. He saw himself as a soldier of Christ, executing heretics who threatened both his king and his faith. The French colonists at Fort Caroline and the shipwreck survivors at Matanzas became footnotes to a larger story. Their attempt at building a new world haven for religious freedom failed absolutely. But perhaps that failure deserves more attention than history has given it. They were the first, after all, the first European settlers in what became the United States to seek religious freedom, and they paid for that dream with their lives.